Thank you so much, Professor McMillan, President Anderson. I commend you all for having picked this topic. When was this whole thing designed? Was this designed like a year ago, 6 months ago? Like 9 months ago. So how you guys could have known that, that this unique political moment. So, just tell me what the stock market's going to do in 9 months, and I'm going to put all my money in it. Well done in terms of the timing. We do live in what feels like an insane time. Raise your hand if it feels to you as though in the last few months the whole world is going crazy. Does it feel that way to you? So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think I found the explanation. Sunspots. It's the only thing that can explain, because it's not just the American political system and both of the parties. It's Brussels, it's Syria, it's global warming, it's everything. And so last night when I was preparing the final version of this talk, and I was thinking, how can we understand all this? And I thought, well, let's look at what sunspot activity has been doing. Because, sunspot activity is sometimes linked with bizarre human behavior. And sure enough, so this is a graph. This is data from NASA. This is a peak that happened between 2000 and 2002. So the 9/11 attacks were right in the middle of that sweet spot of very, very high solar activity. And then we have the run-up to the Iraq War. And then sunspot activity actually goes down quite a ways. But we do actually reach another local maximum beginning in 2014, just as Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and ISIS are all gaining strength. Now, there is some good news here. The good news is that if we trace it out into the future, sunspot activity is going to go down. So all this whole disagreement stuff, it might be gone a year from now. Don't worry. The other thing is it's April 1st, and I just thought I'd put this up for fun. I don't believe that it's sunspots. Don't worry, okay? But it feels that way, right? I mean, it feels like, I was, in the 1990s, I remember thinking, my God, everything is fantastic. I was born in 1963. I grew up assuming that there would be a nuclear war at some point. And by the 90s, that was like unthinkable. And that's all gone. Things seem really threatening. And so the question I want to start out with for you guys is, of all the many threats, and God, this is a terrible way to start a talk. I study positive psychology. Positive emotions open your mind. They broaden and build. And here I am trying to scare the hell out of you. But if you look at this list of threats that we face, which one, read them all, which one do you think is the most serious? If you could make progress on one, which would it be? The correct answer is G, and here's why. Because until we can make progress on G, we can't really do anything about any of the others. Individuals can do things, very, very rich billionaires can do things, but the rest of us as citizens trying to, in any way, inform or influence public policy, we can't really do anything in this country anymore. Our political institutions are paralyzed, except in those brief moments when one party controls all branches of government. Now, what do I mean by hyperpartisanship? So partisanship is not a bad thing. Politics is a good thing, as Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia used to say when I was a professor there. Politics is a good thing. Partisanship can be a good thing. But when partisanship reaches levels that are higher than normal, plus when group identity gets stuck at one level, this is the key that makes it so bad. Okay, superstitious behavior. Something bad happened when I stepped there. So there's a lot of wisdom in this Bedouin proverb: me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother, and cousin against the stranger. That's a very important insight from social psychology, from moral psychology. We're tribal creatures. We're really good at uniting with one group to then fight another group. It used to be that partisanship ended at the ocean's edge, they said. And so Democrats and Republicans would fight, but if it was a foreign policy issue, of course they'd come together. Not anymore. Hyperpartisanship means me against my brother, and I don't care about anything else. It's always me against my brother. And that's where we are. And the third is that partisanship turns politics into a negative-sum game. Politics is always supposed to be a positive-sum game, and that's it. We can't both win. But the rest of the time is governing time, when we compromise. I get 70% of what I want, you get 70% of what you want, it all works out. Not anymore. So this is why I say hyperpartisanship is our most serious problem. Just two graphs on it. So you may have seen versions of this graph. It's a very well-known graph these days. No, it tells you nothing. That would be zero, zero, no polarization. People make decisions based on the issues. There's all kinds of different coalitions. So back in the 1870s, in the decades after the Civil War, we had very high polarization in both the House and the Senate. For a variety of reasons, we get a historically unusual period from the 30s through the 60s of really unusually low partisanship, low polarization. And then it begins going up. So it goes up and up and up, especially in the 80s and into the 90s. And I cut the graph off here at 2004 because you can see the House is already higher than it was in the Civil War. Well, the Senate, they're sort of more mature. You know, they have 6 years. It's not every other year. Maybe the Senate's better. It has a couple years. It's not getting worse. But actually, if you look since 2004, they've both gotten a lot worse. Congress, both houses are about as polarized as they could mathematically be. There are essentially no relationships. That's an exaggeration. There are very weak and few relationships across the parties in Congress anymore. And this is a disaster for our country, for our governance. Well, this is elite polarization. And there are some political scientists who said, well, yes, of course, Congress is polarized, the elites are polarized, but the people aren't. And you could kind of maintain that until around 2004 to 2006, I think. This is data from Pew. This shows, the Pew Survey Research Group. They ask a basket of policy issues, about environmental policy, gun control, race issues, all sorts of things. On average, how far apart are men and women? The answer is the gap between let's take the mean gender difference. You just average together all those absolute values. In 1987, men and women were 4 points apart on average across a bunch of things. And in 2012, it was 6 points. So basically, the gender difference is pretty small on political attitudes, and it's been stable. Religion, a little bit bigger, but still stable. Income, stable. This is race and education. These are larger, so 12 to 14 points. Our country is more divided by race and education level, but those have also been stable. The only thing that's been rising over the last 30 or 40 years is politics. If you look at how far apart were Republicans and Democrats on all this basket of issues, it was just 10 points apart back in '87. Now it's 18. So the people are growing further and further apart. Now, most Americans are centrists. Or they're apolitical. So if you look at specific policy issues, some people aren't really changing, but it's sort of the extremes are really moving apart. But here's the key thing. Here's the most important variable to keep your eye on. It's not people's views about specific issues, it's their views about each other. This is called affective partisan polarization. How do you feel about the other? In the 60s, surveys showed that if you asked people, how would you feel if your son or daughter married someone from the other party? The answer was, it wouldn't really matter. Now, if it's a different religion or race, whoa, but the other party, it's not a big deal. Now it's the reverse. Party is much worse than someone of a different race or religion. What this graph shows is what's called feeling thermometer about the Supreme Court. What do you think about the Republican Party? What do you think about African Americans, Italian Americans, all sorts of things. And so what this shows, the blue line is what do Democrats think about the Democratic Party? And so 100 is very warm, very positive. 0 is very cold, very negative. What do you think? And so Democrats rate the Democratic Party pretty highly, and it's been totally stable from the Carter administration through Obama. Same thing for the Republicans. Now, if we had data from today, I think the Republicans would, I don't know where they'd be, but it's changing now. But for decades, very, very stable. But what do you think about the other party? And here's the big surprise. If 50 is the midpoint of the scale, back in the 70s, people were saying, I kind of dislike them a little bit. It's not that bad back in the 70s and into the 80s. But it's the 90s is the key decade in which we go from a functioning system where there was a lot of bipartisan possibilities to a non-functioning system. So it's in the 90s where we go from slightly negative to now very negative. People really dislike the other side. And this is the key to so much else that follows about our country, even including things happening on campus now. Everything is now part of the culture war. All of our institutions are polarizing with dreadful results for us as a nation. All right. Why? Why is this happening? The answer is that there are many, many historical and sociological and economic trends. It's really difficult to disentangle them. Here's my list of 10, but when I talk with political scientists, right, there's like 5 other causes that I could put up here. as well. So I'm just going to cover a couple of them, and then I'll get into the psychology. And fortunately, Sarah is here. She'll give a talk right afterwards on media fractionation, so because media is a big part of this, but I'm not an expert in that. I'm not really talking about that. So the biggest single cause, the huge tectonic plates that started moving in the 60s, that set a lot of other things in motion, are these first two. So this is an interesting way of representing the House and the Senate back from the 1780s to the present. Let me zoom in and show you what this really is. So this is a way of graphing. This is for the House of Representatives. What this shows, the midline is the middle of the chamber. So this is the left-leaning party, which has, it was the Whigs long ago, but now Democrats, and this is Republicans since the Civil War. And what this graph shows is, if you go back to the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, well, look at this. There's a bunch of red over on this side. There were conservative Democrats. And there's some blue over here. There were liberal Republicans. Not a lot, but there were the parties really did overlap. And then what happens is when Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, because a lot of these conservative Democrats are Southern Democrats, they're only Democrats because Lincoln was a Republican. So when Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, that starts the tectonic plates moving. And Johnson said to Bill Moyers on that day, Moyers came in to congratulate him, and he was morose. Mr. President, this is a great victory. What's wrong? I've just turned the South over to the Republican Party for the rest of my lifetime and yours, he said on that day. And that's what happened. So this group here fades out. They disappear after another decade or two. And note on the Republican side, there were some liberals, in the Northeast and in Washington and Oregon, but almost everybody else. So the light red means sort of moderate, and the dark red means sort of extreme. There were almost no extreme right-wing Republicans. They were almost all moderate. There were some extreme left-wing Democrats, but still they were, so you get the picture. That's the way things were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Most Republicans were fairly centrist. But as these tectonic plates begin to shift, the parties begin to purify, the moderate Republicans shrink and shrink and shrink, as you can see, replaced by sort of more intermediate, and then over time replaced by far-right Republicans. So the Republican Party really begins to purify fairly consistently, beginning with the Reagan administration all the way up through the present. On the Democratic side is the same, but not quite as much. So the Democrats are not quite, they didn't purify quite as much, but it's mostly a mirror image process going on. So when you put this all together, what's happening is that the two parties that used to overlap, we now have for the first time in our history, an entirely left party and an entirely right party. And so it's not a coalition of interest groups and different platforms. It's ideological for the first time, left versus right. And this feeds back now so that individuals sort themselves into the correct party for their ideology. So it used to be that there's a correlation coefficient. Most of the students understand what that is. It's the degree to which two things go together. So 0.4 is sort of moderate in the social sciences. It's not tiny, but it's not huge. So if you knew where someone was on the, but as you can see from 1972 through the present, it's just gone steadily up. It's now a 0.7 correlation, which is quite large. In the social sciences, we don't get correlations much bigger than 0.7 generally. So that's my point, is that in a sense the correct party for whether they were on the right and the left. And once that happened, now it was like these gigantic leans to the left going to go to the Democrats. So that's the history of the background here. There's another major historical trend, and this is the last one I'll show, the generational changing of the guard. So the way the world looks to you between about the ages of 18 and 24 tends to stick for life. People move, but there is some evidence that however the world looked to you when you were sort of in college and early 20s, that burns in so that it turns out it's really interesting if you're white, but America, the intense politics of the late 60s burned into this 6 to 8 year span of college students and they're Democrats for life. So what happened to the greatest generation? They all came together to fight the greatest evil we'd ever seen, the most pitch-perfect Hollywood villain, Hitler, and to fight Nazism and to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. And so when Democrats and Republicans faced challenges, they had this ability to come together for the good of the country. So Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill could be bitter enemies over any policy issue, but one of them would say to the other, they were both Irish, and they'd say, you know, it's 5 o'clock, time to break out the bourbon. And they would drink together. So this is the way, politicians have amazing interpersonal skills, and they were able to use them. But what was the burned-in experience of people born between 1946 and 1965? It wasn't fighting a foreign enemy. It was fighting each other. The early baby boomers especially. It was fighting each other over gender, over especially race and Vietnam, and then also secondarily gender and other issues. So Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich really disliked each other. They were the first sort of baby boomers in power here. But there were enough older people in Washington who had the norms, the institutional memory. Washington still worked, and they did compromise over a lot of issues. Okay, the greatest generation and then the silent generation retire from public life in the 1990s, so that now here's where we are, or were, until Boehner was forced out because he wasn't far right enough. They really dislike each other, and even though they're both skillful politicians and they could have reached a compromise themselves, their parties were so hostile and polarized that they were not able to reach compromise on most of the major issues where we desperately needed some public policy. So these are some of the trends. If you'll notice, most of these trends really hit in the 90s and 2000s. And so the overall trend here is there are a lot of things that are driving us into this greater polarization. This is not something that we can turn around easily. I'll say at the end, I think the goal is not necessarily to turn it around, but to harden our institutions so that we can live with this greater polarization. But what I'm going to do now is switch gears because I'm not a political scientist. My job isn't to explain, this history is, I think, a helpful background. But what I really came to talk to you about today is moral psychology, is what's going on in each individual's mind so that as we get these historical trends cranking up the hostile identities and parties, as we get all these historical trends, what are they doing to our minds that evolved and developed for a certain kind of moral life? This life of righteousness, anger, outrage, partisanship. So let me tell you about that. Just by the way, I have a short article in the Washington Post. If you want to read about the other 7, just Google HAIDT top 10 reasons. And that will pull up that article. But now if we look at the moral psychology, that's what my book, The Righteous Mind, is about. So that's an image of the hardcover. In the very initial edition, the idea was to have it was an actual slit. The cover was actually torn, although the sales force said, no, you can't do that because it'll rip, and so they had to redo it. But I have a few copies of it with the actual rip in it. That's true. That's true. I should sell a little do-it-yourself kit. Yes, it's a pair of scissors, $100. Okay. But a good cover sort of conveys the idea of the book in an instant. So I like this cover very much. In the UK, they have a very different art department, different publisher, different company. They made up their own cover. Here it is. I love it, but I'm glad it's not the American cover. But I love being able to show it. And then the American paperback is this. I suggested the idea of angels and demons, sort of Manichaeism, which I'll mention later. So I think this also captures the way that we think, good versus evil. So the book, I know some of the students and faculty read it. Raise your hand if you've read part of this book at least. Raise your hand. Oh, wow. Okay, wonderful. So like maybe about 20% of you have actually read some of it. But I'll just briefly summarize. This is the book right here. 3 points. If you understand these 3 points, you understand moral psychology. So I'm just going to illustrate each of those 3 and then talk about what can we do. So intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. So my first book was called The Happiness Hypothesis. It was about ancient wisdom, ancient ideas. And every ancient society has the idea. I'm going to test okay, yeah. So that was just, okay, I can walk over here. All right. Every ancient society had noticed that the mind is divided into parts that conflict. So Plato gives us the metaphor that the mind, he gives us the metaphor in the Phaedrus, the mind is like a charioteer, which is reason, struggling mightily to control these wild horses of the passions. And if a man can do that, well, that's the highest life. That's what a philosopher should do, learn to control his passions. So that's the way philosophers have typically talked about the mind. Reason either is or ought to be in charge. My favorite philosopher is David Hume. David Hume was a superb psychologist. And one of Hume's most famous quotes from the treatise on human nature is, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." So Hume was saying, yeah, all my fellow philosophers always worshiping reasoning as though it's this highest, wonderful good. They have no idea what they're talking about. That's not what reason is or is even able to do. Let's have a philosophy that's consistent with human psychology. Because back then, philosophy and psychology were actually the same field. They hadn't split yet. Now, I think Hume really got it right, and that's what my early research was on, about the emotional dog and its rational tail. But the way to really update this metaphor is not so much slave of the passions, but servant. And the best metaphor of all is the press secretary. The man you see here, actually the man in the middle, is Josh Earnest, who was the president's press secretary. He's very smart. He's a partner with Obama. He doesn't make policy, but he's really, really smart at how to explain it to the public and the press. That's his job. And what I found in my early research, I used to think that reason and intuition, or I used to think reason and emotion, were like separate things that you could pit against each other. And I had a lot of trouble doing that because reasoning always seemed to follow the emotion. I finally said, okay, I guess Hume was entirely right. Reason is the press secretary, and it's not emotion, but really intuition is the broader term, is really what's driving things. So to illustrate that, here's this wonderful formulation from Tom Gilovich, a psychologist at Cornell. Whenever you're in a discussion or argument, whenever you're trying to persuade someone of something, keep this in mind. We're always asking either, must I believe it or can I believe it? If you say something and someone doesn't want to believe it, they resist where you're drawing them, they're going to be asking, must I believe it? And then they're thinking, can I find any way out? Can I find any reason to doubt this case? And if I find one reason, I'm done. I don't have to believe it. I'm free. And then you stop thinking. Conversely, if you want to believe something, if you want to believe that Obama is a Muslim who was born in Kenya, then you want to believe it, and you say, well, I read something in the News of the World that, any scrap. What you're looking for is permission. Do I have permission to believe this thing that I want to believe? And then you're done. You stop. What we're really bad at is saying, what's all the evidence here? What's all the evidence here? Which one has more evidence? We're really, really bad at that. And so some of the experiments that demonstrate this are of the following sort. So in a famous study by Ziva Kunda, students who are in a psychology class, they come in to do experiments after class as part of the requirement. And in one of the studies, they're asked to read an article. It looks like it's an article from Science or Nature. And it seems to show that caffeine and breast cancer are associated. There's a statistical link between caffeine consumption and breast cancer. And your job in this study is to evaluate the methods. You're taking psychology, you're learning about experimental methods and sample sizes and statistical inference. What do you think? How good is this study? Who do you think finds lots of flaws in that study? The coffee drinkers? All coffee drinkers find flaws in the study? Women who drink coffee. Women who drink coffee are saying, must I believe it? And they say, well, the sample size is only 500 people. That's not big enough. And they didn't control for what kind of coffee and, or whatever. The point is, they're desperate to get out of it. So they list all kinds of flaws. But the men who drink coffee or the women who don't say, oh, I didn't know that. I guess coffee causes, So, all right. So the point is motivated reasoning. Our reasoning, so the gut feeling comes first. I don't want to believe it. Must I believe it? And you send your reasoning out. Josh Earnest, go find me a reason to discredit this study. I don't want to believe it. And reason does. Here's another study. Subjects come into the lab, and they are in front of a computer, and they've given a button to press. And if they correctly press, a bunch of stuff flashes up on the screen. And if they press the button within a second after a letter appears, they get, let's say, a nickel. But if they press it any other time, they don't get anything. And so they're looking, and you're pressing buttons, and then you see this flash up. Whoop. So what was that? What was it that flashed up? Yeah. Okay, so it depends. So if you're being paid to spot letters, you'd see that as a B. But half the people are paid to spot numbers. They see it as a 13. Now, it's important that nobody thinks this is a Q. Okay? Nobody thinks it's 19. It's, if there's ambiguity, then we see what we want to see. We're not crazy. We're motivated. So if there's ambiguity, we see what we want to see. Now, tell me a major political issue on which America is divided where there is no ambiguity. Right? Now, you may think, I know some of you are going to say, oh, global warming, or there's no ambiguity. Well, no, there's a lot of ambiguity on all of these issues, and that's why they are eternal. That's why each side thinks the other side is not just crazy and stupid, but disingenuous and evil. Okay, so the metaphor that I use from the happiness hypothesis, reasoning, it's not so much the charioteer and the horses. A better metaphor, I think, is a small little guy on top of an elephant with no reins, trying to get the elephant to go to the right or left. And if the elephant wants to, he will, but the elephant's really big and powerful. So that, I think, is a better metaphor. All right, so that's the point. From the basic psychology, the cognitive psychology, the social psychology, we engage in motivated reasoning, and this is why you guys, a lot of you, the students here, or you're part of this project on disagreement. It's as your president said, this is what college is supposed to be about. You're supposed to be challenged. You're supposed to engage with each other, not with intimidation, not with threats, but with reasons. Now, you can't expect your reasons to persuade each other because of what I've just shown you. You can't expect to make a good argument, expect others to say, oh, you're right. But you still can, if you engage in the right way over time with trust, over time you improve each other's thought. So this is not a hopeless exercise, but it's a hard one because of this psychology. All right, let's move on to the next one. There's more to morality than harm and fairness. So when I did a postdoc in anthropology, my subject from the time I started graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania was what is morality and why does it vary across cultures in such a way that it's different across cultures, but a lot of the elements are actually very, very same all around the world, and how do you make sense of this? And so the theory that I came up with some of my colleagues, and it draws a lot on an anthropologist named Richard Schwader, is called moral foundations theory. And the observation was this. As I would read anthropology and read ethnographies, the way, like mothering, it's different around the world, but so much is the same. The attachment system is the same. And then I would read the evolutionary psychology, and there'd be all this stuff about, well, the attachment system, and how it evolved, what it is to be a mammal, and on reciprocity and fairness. So I just began seeing links between what the evolutionary psychologists were talking about and the things I was reading in anthropology. And so my approach was to say, well, what are the most likely sort of like taste buds of the moral sense, the things that evolution put into our minds, which culture then builds on? Culture can't just build any morality. It has to build with what it's been given by evolution. So what's there? And I think these are the 6 best candidates. There's more than these 6, but these are the 6, I think, for which the evidence is really strong. So the first foundation is care, issues of care and harm. So we're mammals, and what does that mean? Literally, it means that we have mammary glands, we nurse our young, but if you nurse your young, it means you have a very, very long childhood. You invest a lot in them. And so human minds are designed not just to produce milk when the baby needs it, but to produce care and protection over many, many years. And not just in female minds, but in male minds as well. That's not true in most primates, but in humans it is. And so once you see this, that care and compassion for the vulnerable is part of human nature, now look at our political disagreements. These are photos I took at Occupy Wall Street. A lot of photos there about compassion, care, empathy. Free empathy. Compassion is our new currency. You will never see signs like this at a Tea Party rally. It just doesn't happen. They love their children. They love their dogs. But their politics is not about care and compassion. Second foundation, fairness and cheating. So we evolved to be really good cooperators, and that means we're really sensitive to people who are taking without giving. Raise your hand if you have a roommate. Okay, raise your hand if you think you do more than 50% of the house cleaning and other errands. Raise your hand, right? So we all know that everybody else is a blood-sucking cheater, but we do 60% of the work, right? Okay. So because we have evolved with mechanisms for catching cheaters, for monitoring contributions. We really don't like cheaters. Now, there's different ways, though, to do that. So on the left, and at Occupy Wall Street, there's a lot of talk about fairness, but it's always equality, never proportionality. It's equality. So the 1% own 43%. Now, suppose that's a true statement. If you're on the left, that's obviously unfair. And if you're on the right, you say, okay, that might be true, Did Steve Jobs create 43 times more value than I did? Yeah. It's fine with me if Steve Jobs is a multi-trillionaire. So equality of outcome is a very important standard on the left, not an issue on the right. On the right, it's all about proportionality. So spread my work ethic, not my wealth. These are photos taken by Emily Eakins at a Tea Party rally a couple years ago. Stop punishing success, meaning, why do we tax the rich at higher rates? We're just penalizing success. Stop rewarding failure. Why do we have welfare payments for individuals and for banks? If they fail, let them suffer the consequences. That way they'll learn. That's the ethos on the right. And again, this is all social, the social left versus the right, not libertarian. So again, you see that the concept of fairness is universal, but it has multiple applications. So we disagree. When we debate over what's fair, we're talking about different things. Liberty is a little different because there we're more similar. For Americans in particular, liberty, freedom are our founding ethos. This is the flag, this is the seal on the flag of my former state, Virginia. I was at UVA for 14 years, and it wasn't until I started writing The Righteous Mind that I thought to ask, why is there a dead person on our flag? Why is there a murder? And the reason is because the flag was created in the late 1770s when the American colonists had rebelled against their king. These were not Americans, these were English people. English people living in America rebelled against the English king. And they had to justify that. And so they called him a tyrant. Now, I'm American, I think he was a tyrant. Read the Declaration of Independence, it's all these terrible things he did to us. But the point is that there's this deep psychology of if you feel as you're being bullied, oppressed, pushed down on, you don't just get angry or hurt. You want to band together with others and overthrow him and ultimately kill him. There's a very deep psychology, it's a primate psychology, of responding to an alpha male bully. So now you can understand this image from Occupy Wall Street. It shows a fist, the 99%, and a little man says 1%. So if the 99% would just get together, we could crush and kill the rich. Fortunately, that idea has gone from our political life in the last couple of years. No, never mind. But the point is, it's a very deep psychology. Band together, and then the weak become stronger than the strong. And so on the left, the 1% in corporations are the oppressor. On the right, it's the same psychology, but it's the government that's the oppressor. We need to come together. That's where you get the militia movements. So here, the feeling of angry reactance is similar, but the target is different. So those are the three foundations that left and right all have in common. Now we move on to three foundations that are stronger on the right. So loyalty and betrayal. There are a number of animal species that can work as groups, but they are always siblings. There's no other species on the planet that can come together in groups that are not siblings. Humans are extremely good at it. We evolved for war. We evolved for intergroup violent conflict. We're very good at coming together, coordinating to defeat with violence our enemies. And because we are designed for this, it feels really good. We love it. We enjoy it. Men more than women like this. But that's why we have sports. I mean, there's no other explanation for sports, right? I mean, what a complete waste of time. But, and it's not just the sports. It's the fandom. Like, why do people do this? It's because it's play war. And it's fun. It's fun to be part of the group and to cheer on your warriors and to win is great, great fun. It's thrilling. So this is a part of our psychology, but it's stronger on the right. And what I mean by that, I don't know whether conservatives like sports more, but this stuff feeds more into social conservative politics than it does into left-wing politics. So at Tea Party rallies, at conservative rallies, lots and lots of American flags. Ann Coulter wrote a book called Treason, Liberal Treachery from the Cold War to the War on Terror. So the idea of who's loyal, who's a traitor. Big issue on the right, and you find this in other countries as well. On the left, so this is an image from Occupy Wall Street. I did see flags at Occupy Wall Street. Half of the flags I saw had writing on them. The flag is not sacred on the left. The flag can be used as an instrument of political protest. It's not a sacred object on the left. Stop Americanism. Again, so protesting against America is a noble and time-honored thing to do on the left. Now, a more positive spin on the left's anti-patriotism would be to say that it's actually a form of universalism. The left doesn't like divisions. They like more the idea of we're all one family, global government, United Nations, national borders are arbitrary. So there's a big difference between left and right in how they think about groups, especially national groups. Fifth foundation, authority and subversion. We're primates, we show deference to authority the same way other primates do. We bow, we get small. A lot of the same ethology is found across primates. Not exactly the same, but clearly we evolved for hierarchy. On the right, hierarchy and authority are thought to be good things. So it's from a church in Charlottesville. God's in charge, so shut up. Now, obviously meant in part as a joke, but what do you think the odds are this is a Unitarian church? Okay? That could not be a Unitarian church. And just, because they wouldn't say God, would they? So sorry, I shouldn't. So, okay. Whereas, so this is an advertisement for the magazine The Nation, insubordination. Because if there is authority, you should undercut. Authority is a bad thing. Hierarchy is a bad thing. If someone's up there, take them down. So again, very big left-right difference in respect for authority. And the last one, sanctity degradation. The idea that there's something special, sacred, pure, must be protected. You see it often in ideas about female sexuality, chastity in many religions. Not all, but in many religions you see this. And so this is a medieval image. It's the allegory of chastity. It shows the Virgin Mary and basically a rock chastity belt, essentially, with all this iconography of purity, water flowing beneath her legs, guarded by not just a lion, two lions, not just two lions with gold shields. Okay, so purity, sanctity, chastity. So that's one Madonna. Here's another Madonna, much more popular on the left. Sexuality is a good thing. Chastity is a bad thing. Express yourself. Now, here's a photo I took in Charlottesville. Your body may be a temple, but mine's an amusement park, you stupid, prudish conservatives, is the subtext. So on these issues of sanctity, purity, the right makes a big deal out of it, the left does less. Now, if you go into any sort of like yoga store, or you do find elements of purity on the left, but in terms of national politics, abortion, gay rights, all these issues that are seen as these, anything related to sex, the right and left have predictable positions. So those are the 6 foundations. Oh, a photo at Occupy Wall Street. Nothing is sacred. I have no idea what it means. You could not find such a photo at any right-wing rally. It would just never appear. But on the left, it makes sense to say nothing's sacred. So if these are the 6 innate psychological foundations that cultures build on in variable ways, I've shown you how left and right build on these in different ways. And this is what we find in terms of the data. If you go to yourmorals.org, it's my research site, you can take the surveys yourself. What we find is that when people come to the site, they register, they say what their politics is. People who say they're very conservative they express agreement with our statements about all of the 6 foundations roughly equally. They value all of them. But people who say that they're very liberal or very far on the left, they put care and compassion above all else. Now, this is fairness as proportionality. If I had fairness as equality, it would slope down. But the point is that on the left, they build especially on care, fairness, and liberty. On the right, they build on all of them. The steepest slope is these things, sanctity and authority especially. So these are the ones where the left says, no, this is not part of morality. This is fascism. This is tribalism. This is Trumpism, whatever they would say. This is not part of morality, but this stuff is. So this is the nature of the culture war. And so Emily Ekins, this political scientist, she and I got a version of our Moral Foundations questionnaire on a national survey back in November where they asked people, moral motives are driving Americans to all the different candidates. And here's what we found. So if you do a big regression analysis trying to predict who has each person as their favorite candidate, if you want to understand who likes Donald Trump, even after you bring in age, sex, race, and all, because all that stuff matters a lot for Trump. As you know, it's mostly less educated white men are Trump's core supporters. So if you know all that, does knowing their moral foundation scores add anything on top of prediction? What else can it tell you if you know the moral foundation scores? The answer is that for Trump, being low on care, even taking account that this is already like more working class men who are going to score lower anyway, people who specifically say that they're less compassionate, they don't care about animal suffering as much, things like that. It's sort of a cold heart and a liking for authority, loyalty, and sanctity. So you probably heard it said that Donald Trump is an authoritarian or is appealing to authoritarianism, and I think this is true, and this is the evidence for it. Yes, Trump is, there was a wonderful article about Trump and fascism a month or two ago. Trump is not a fascist in that he has no coherent ideology, so if he, it's not the things he says are not at all what fascists said. But in terms of personality, and I'm sorry, I'm non-political myself, so please bear with me. I'll insult both sides equally, I hope. But Trump is appealing. He's pressing moral buttons that are the profile of authoritarianism. Now, and this is really interesting. My God, do you remember when Hillary Clinton took a long bathroom break at the first debate, or whatever the debate was, and Donald Trump said, I know where she went. It's disgusting. I don't want to talk about it. It's disgusting. I mean, come on. All the candidates went to the bathroom. They urinated, right? We know that. They went to the bathroom. It's a 4-hour thing. Of course they went to the bathroom. But Trump is very incredibly germ sensitive. He has this psychology of threat, of invisible threat, coming over the borders of your body or of Mexico to rape and kill us. Okay? I'm joking, but that's the psychology of disgust. And purity says the borders are porous. We must defend against the invisible threats. And this feeds into his politics and into his policy. For Cruz and Rubio, who were the Tea Party darlings, it's all proportionality. If you already know that people are religious and conservative, well, if you need to know this too. Because people, religious conservatives, who are high on this, who are really upset about people who are cheating, taking things they don't deserve, getting benefits they don't deserve, they're going to go for Cruz or Rubio. Whereas, interestingly, both Ben Carson and Huckabee, who had more the sort of the warm, loving, for them it wasn't proportionality at all. They were actually high on care. So even if you know where people are in terms of left-right, the moral foundations add a lot to prediction. They tell you a lot about what else is going on. Okay. And so again, this proportionality. So on the Democratic side, Sanders is really low on proportionality, which is what you need if you are a redistributionist. I don't care how much you worked. You've got more, I'm taking more. That's a direct violation of proportionality. But if you don't care about proportionality, Sanders is your guy. Also very low on authority sanctity. They're actually more libertarian. They're anti-authority. For Clinton, interestingly, there's no moral foundation. Because again, what's Clinton's morality? Does anybody know? What's her ideology? Does anybody know? So if you know, right? I mean, if you know that someone is female or non-white or liberal, but not as liberal as Sanders, then you can predict. So in other words, demographic factors predict Clinton's support, not moral factors, whereas many of the other candidates are making moral appeals. So that's the second. So this is, I'm trying to give you is sort of the deep structure of the culture war. And if you guys are going to be having difficult conversations here, now it's on many issues, race and gender, all sorts of things, but I hope you'll have conversations across the political divide. And I hope that this will serve as a roadmap for why it is that people don't see things the same. All right, the last one, I'll do this more briefly, morality binds and blinds, the third principle of moral psychology. So, as I said, there are other species that can cooperate, but they're always siblings. The only species that can cooperate in hundreds or thousands or millions are the Hymenoptera, the bees, ants, wasps, and termites. There are a few others, naked mole rats, a few others, but they're all siblings. They're all sisters in this case. And here's a termite mound, about 20 or 30 feet tall in Australia. Termites, little tiny termites, did it. They're all sisters and brothers. They're all from the same mother. So that's nature's trick for getting large-scale cooperation. They're all in the same boat, and they're all sterile. They can't reproduce. So it's one for all for one. It's amazing. There's only one exception to this rule. There's only one species that can build big things like this without having to work with siblings, and that is us. You do not find civilization emerging without temples. Wherever you find civilization, if you dig, you'll find temples. That was our trick. That's what got us started. So this is Babylon, and this is Tenochtitlan. And so humans have this amazing trick. We have this ability to make something sacred, and then we circle around it. So these are Muslims at prayer in Mecca, the Kaaba. It's very common to literally circle around a sacred object. It feels good. It feels right. And so a metaphor that you can use here, if you've taken high school physics or college physics, when you move a wire through a magnetic field, it generates a current. It can do some work. And Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, used this metaphor of social electricity. Rituals, group movements, mass protests, they're electrifying. So this is the metaphor. Religious activity, we circle, we unite, and then we can work together. It doesn't have to be a god. It can be a flag. That's why we have flags in battles. You treat it as a sacred object, you defend it, people give their life to protect the flag, and then you can trust each other. But as with electrical current, you get a polarity. If you get this current, you get a positive side and a negative side. You get our side is perfectly good, their side is perfectly evil. So here's an animation I had a video artist make. Because as I was studying this stuff, it just felt like there's this electromagnet, with like one magnet, one end on, in the Atlantic Ocean, one in the Pacific Ocean. Well, it doesn't work because both sides are on the left, but let's say one in the Mississippi River, whatever. There's like a giant electromagnet, and the current keeps rising and rising and rising from the 1990s through now. It just keeps getting stronger and stronger. Anything that has a slight left-right charge, it's pulled to one side. And so I asked them it's as though there used to be people on the left, the right, the purple, or the center, and they used to associate with each other in Congress. They used to be friendships in the 50s and 60s. They could really work together. But by the 2000s, everything had been pulled apart. There's no more overlap, and Congress has very few friendships and no overlap anymore. This is what's happened to our politics. And it's not just the elites, as I told you, it's also the people. So this, you'll see, it turns into the electoral map from 2004, which is quite stark, but it's still roughly the same today. We live in different parts of the country. Now, it turns out it's not so much state by state. It's actually urban-rural. And so the states that have their population in big cities all go left, rural areas all go right. But we're divided. We're very divided now. And this hyperactivates our Manichaean tendencies. So Manichaeism refers to, Manichaeism was in the Persian area in the 3rd century, I think it was. And he preached that the world is a battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and we all have to decide, are you on the side of good or evil? And so if you look at it this way, and this is George Bush saying, you're either with us or against us. This is it's the mindset. It's a mindset which is very good in time of war. And there's a whole psychology. In fact, a lot of our religious psychology undergirds our politics. The idea of heretics, traitors, and apostates. The worst people in the world are not actually your enemy. The worst people in the world are the people on your team who then help the enemy, or in any other way betray you, or even just leave you. Those are the people that some religions urge you to kill. And so when there was a giant storm that devastated New York and New Jersey in particular, and the governor of the hardest hit state met with the president in a time of emergency when a lot of people were without power, without food, it was an emergency, and they worked together. Well, that's what's supposed to happen, right? No, not anymore. Is Chris Christie a GOP traitor? He actually said a good thing about the president of his country when they worked together, and many people thought this was a bad thing for him to do. The temperature is rising. We're now seeing the first, until recently, I always would say to people, but let's not get carried away, there's no violence. At least nobody's getting killed over this, which is fantastic. Lots of countries have gone through these tensions, and hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and that has not been happening here. But we are seeing the first hints of violence. I don't want to blame it on one side or another, because it seems the Sanders people are, in my opinion, if you're just protesting, that's fine. But when you try to shout someone down, when you try to say you can't speak, and then the other side gets violent with you, both sides are wrong, in my opinion. Anyway, this is what's happening. We are seeing the first hints of political violence, which is very alarming to me. It's still small, but we're seeing the hints of it. So, to return, hyperpartisanship, I hope you see now that our partisanship is at levels much higher than historically normal, that our group identity, not for everyone, but for partisans and for many of our leaders, is stuck at one level. It doesn't switch around, this me against my brother part, and it has turned our politics into a negative-sum game. So, what now? What can we do? There's a lot that we can do to improve Congress. As I said, we can't turn around these historical trends, most of them, but our Congress was designed, our whole political system was designed to fend off tyranny, and it's very good at that. But it's not designed to handle this kind of lack of trust and partisanship. And things like the filibuster, there are all sorts of things that make it even less effective. So there's all sorts of things that we can do. The most important single thing, in my opinion, is get rid of closed party primaries. That's the worst thing in our system. Because in the primary, if you're a Republican, it's only the most, it's 5% of your state or district, which makes the people running be even more extreme than the average, than Americans are. So we need to change those around. And a few states, California, I think Iowa, Iowa, a few states have done this and have had generally good results, although it's complicated. Secondly, once people get to Congress people, from what I hear, are generally very decent people. They're very hardworking people. Most of them, they really go there to make problems, to fix things. But the situation drives them to hyperpartisanship more than they want. One of those is the money chase. There are many others. And a third issue is these are people with amazing political skills and human skills. We need to let them use their skills. And so Newt Gingrich really did a terrible thing when he changed the calendar in the 1990s so that all business is done from Tuesday afternoon through Thursday at lunchtime, roughly. So that he told when he took, the Republicans took over the House, and he said, don't move to Washington. Because he didn't want them making friends. He didn't want their spouses making friends. He wanted them to stay in their districts, fly into Washington Tuesday morning, bunk with other Republicans 2 nights, then go home. That way there'll be no friendships, and it worked. So simply changing the calendar so that they're in session 5 days a week for 3 weeks a month, and then they're home for a week and a half. Something like that, something that simple would really help. So a lot of these ideas are from a great book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks by Mann and Ornstein. And if you go to civilpolitics.org, a site that I've co-run, you can find some hints there. So there's a lot we can do in Congress. There's a lot we can do on campus because campuses are polarizing. Campuses, because the faculty lean very far to the left, campuses are left-leaning institutions, so they've gone from leaning left to now being more active players in the culture war. And the students are getting radicalized as well. So we're starting to see more and more people on the left saying, whoa, I'm liberal, but I'm being attacked and pilloried. And there's a real rising, well, some people have called it a division between the liberal left and the illiberal left. People who say, you can't say that, you can't wear that, I get to say what you do. So more and more professors, especially on the coasts in the Northeast, are having these experiences where they're surprised at what's happening to them and being brought up on charges for things. All sorts of things are happening now. And so there's a lot that we can do and that you're beginning to try to do here at St. Olaf's. So I think one of the ways we can avoid, we don't want universities to just turn into things that generate really angry warriors for the left. We want our universities to generate citizens who can listen to ideas and talk to each other and try to persuade each other. So how can we get that on campus? Because we're losing it, frankly, in a lot of schools. It sounds like things might be better here, but in schools that I've been at, we're losing it. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do is embrace our talk about diversity. But why is it that diversity is good? We say that it's because it's important to get other viewpoints, and that's what the research shows. The benefit of diversity isn't just having people look different. The benefits of diversity, both in school and in the workplace, come from having people who think differently, who look at something and don't see it the same way that you do. That's where the benefit comes from. So I think we need to expand our talk about diversity, which is always about race, gender, sexual orientation, just a few other things. It never includes politics. In almost any statement you see, it doesn't include actual. So George Will has this interesting line. He says, there's a certain kind of liberal that wants diversity in everything except thought. And this is what's happened to our universities. We talk about diversity all day long. But if we find someone who's a conservative, we're not going to hire him. And boy, are we going to all jump on him if he says something in class. So I started a site called Heterodox Academy with a bunch of other professors who are libertarians, centrist like me, left, right. We're all concerned that the social sciences are flipping, are going from leaning left, which is fine, to being so radically left that there's an orthodoxy. And we're trying to break that up because the sciences can't work if there's an orthodoxy. So one of our proposals, I'll see what you think, this is just something I came up with a few weeks ago, is let's change the summer reading. Diversity is really difficult, it's really challenging, it's really divisive, so how should we prepare our students? How should we prepare them? People coming from overseas, people come from different social classes. How should we get them ready to interact with people? Should we have them read books about oppression, which is most of what the summer reading lists are? They're mostly about colonialism, oppression. Is that the best way to get people ready for encounters with diversity? Our thought is, let's draw on ancient wisdom. Let's identify these psychological mechanisms that make us so self-righteous, stubborn, demonizing, tribal, So we're putting together a book of quotations from the Sermon on the Mount, from Buddha. The Dhammapada is just brilliant on how to tone down anger and moralism, how to deal with people who criticize you, who say things you don't like. So we have a whole bunch of quotations that will help people deal with diversity. And the most important book of all, you should not be allowed on a college campus until you read this book. Raise your hand if you read this book. Anybody? Okay. Do you endorse it? Those of you who read it, do you endorse it? In 7th grade. Okay, yeah. It's so obvious. It's like it turned my life around when I read this in graduate school, because I was sort of a, arrogant, know-it-all, obnoxious, maybe you think I still am, but but when I read this in graduate school, it was like, oh my God, this is the most brilliant social psychology in the world. He's absolutely right. If you want to persuade someone, don't argue. Saying, you're wrong and here's why, what's that going to do? So show respect for the other person's opinion. Never tell someone he's wrong. And if you're wrong, admit it. Say what you're wrong about. It has magical powers on the other person, who now might be willing to say what he or she is wrong about. This is what we should all be reading to prepare for encounters with different kinds of people. And one of the most classic books of all, nobody should be allowed on a college campus until they've read On Liberty. And I know it's not that long, but we're going to make a version of it that's only about 20% of the length, so it'll be really easy to read. It's going to have all the key quotes about freedom of speech and dealing with why it is that we need opposition. We can't think straight unless we have our opponents to push us. So I'll end with these 2 quotes from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race. Those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. So if people have views that you find offensive, if they have beliefs about the way the world works, about human nature, about gender, even about race, if people have different beliefs, different views about affirmative action, whatever it is, we can either silence them so that nobody challenges us for 4 years, or we can welcome them, debate with them, and try to hash it out, and it will make us all smarter. Another quote, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. So a college education that does not put you face to face with political diversity is one that does not prepare you to think, and certainly doesn't prepare you to think out in the workplace or the political world. And so the very last that I'll read is from Abe Lincoln to remind us that we've been through much, much worse times. I mean, nothing compares to the Civil War. At the beginning of that, as the hostilities were beginning, Lincoln said, "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Thank you.